December 23rd, 1944. German observation hill in Seine-en-Champs, Belgium. The sergeant of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division adjusted his binoculars over his eyes, and upon seeing what was approaching, muttered in a low voice, "This can't be happening." The day before, the command of the 47th Panzer Corps was still confident. General von Lüttwitz believed that Bastogne would fall by starvation, not combat. After all, no encircled army survives without supplies. At least, that was what the doctrine taught. That belief was about to be demolished, not by tanks, not by infantry, but by a demonstration of logistical power on an industrial scale. At 11:45 a.m. that morning, 241 American aircraft crossed the icy sky of the Ardennes, in formation, in silence, in mass. They did not bring bombs. They brought ammunition, food, plasma, gasoline, and conviction. And they showed the German besiegers that they were stuck in time, while the war had already entered the future. This video reconstructs the moment when the siege became a lesson, and the enemy discovered that courage was not enough to win. It was necessary to keep his soldiers alive, and only a nation with thousands of planes and fuel to spare could do that. In that December sky, Germany saw its defeat fly before its eyes. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any explosion or pitched battle. At the height of the siege of Bastogne, in just a single day, the United States managed to drop more than 1,000 tons of supplies over a completely besieged city from the sky. While the Luftwaffe could barely get 100 aircraft in the air across the Western Front, 241 American C-47 planes flew in perfect formation, crossing clouds of flak to deliver fuel, plasma, ammunition, and hope. For German soldiers, this was not just a resupply, it was a demonstration that modern warfare was no longer won by strategy, but by stockpiling. An entire air force was used to feed a division, and this simple operation proved that Germany was, at last, out of its time. If you value the story told with rigor, data, and respect for memory, leave your like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue revealing the backstage of the war, not for the glory, but for the truth. By mid-December 1944, as winter cemented its hold on the forests of the Ardennes, the German High Command believed it was about to rewrite the fate of the war. Operation Wacht am Rhein, named the Watch on the Rhine, was more than just an offensive. It was the last card of a collapsing empire. Adolf Hitler saw in it the real possibility of splitting the Allied armies in half, reconquering the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing a favorable armistice. Confidence was such that some officers celebrated in advance the breakthrough of the Western Front. Official German rhetoric evoked France's glory days in 1940, lightning advance, total surprise, chaos among enemies, and an overwhelming moral turnaround. The Wehrmacht wanted to repeat the formula, and in the first few days, it seemed like he could do it. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, under the command of General Major Heinz Kokott, was one such unit pushed into the center of the operation with promises of redemption. Made up of remaining veterans from the Eastern Front and reinforced by Luftwaffe recruits and deployed Marines, the division marched with discipline and restored morale. Their armor was operational, their artillery supplied, and the terrain looked promising. German intelligence claimed that the American front was occupied by disorganized and exhausted units on a course of rest. For the generals, the scenario was ideal. 7 main roads converged at Bastogne. It was enough to isolate the junction, to stifle all American logistics in the Ardennes. The tactical plan was as simple as it was ambitious, and precisely for this reason, the German commanders underestimated everything they could not see. They ignored that, on the other end of the line, the United States was no longer fighting as it had in 1942. American doctrine had evolved, not just on the battlefield, but in factories, on railroads, in arsenals. While the Germans planned to move troops along narrow, frozen roads, the Americans were already transporting entire units in mechanized convoys with full air support. As the Luftwaffe imploded under shortages of pilots and fuel, the USAF added hundreds of planes to its fleet each month. In 1944, the United States was already producing more than 96,000 military aircraft per year. Germany, in its best effort, barely exceeded 40,000. This disproportion, almost 5 times greater, was ignored or treated as irrelevant in German operational calculations. If you were surprised by this number, write in the comments, "absolute power." In the Ardennes theatre, this asymmetry was still invisible. German troops marched in confidence that surprise and cold would do the job that tanks could not sustain for long. The commanders, with their eyes on the maps and the fog, believed that the enemy would collapse before they could even react. The terrain was familiar, the weather favored, and the experience of the blitzkrieg seemed sufficient. The notion that the enemy could react in depth, reposition forces with speed, and even more, supply an entire division by air. All this was considered unlikely, if not impossible. Germany bet on the classic model: speed, siege, and logistical collapse. But this formula required the enemy to depend on the ground, and the United States that December was already looking up. What the German commanders did not see, did not accept, or simply did not understand, was that they were about to face not an equivalent force, but an industrial structure designed to sustain the war indefinitely. There was no way of knowing, looking only at maps or positions, that in less than a week the 101st Airborne would be holding out at Bastogne with more ammunition than many German divisions possessed in offensive operation. And this is not by luck, but by doctrine. The German belief in scarcity as a weapon proved outdated. They did not imagine that an American battalion could fire projectiles received by parachute only minutes before. With each step toward Bastogne, the illusion of tactical superiority grew stronger, but it also came close to collapse. A collapse that would not come from a defeat on the field, but from a confrontation with reality. That it was no longer enough to be faster, more aggressive, or more experienced. It was necessary to be more supplied, and that, in that war, meant being American. One of the intelligence officers of the 47th Panzer in post-war interrogation would admit clearly, "Our greatest weakness was to think that the war could still be won by maneuver, but they won by permanence." What would come next would prove that not even a perfect encirclement could stop the avalanche of steel and fuel that the United States was about to launch from the sky. Because, the next morning, the horizon line would cease to be just geography and would become the stage for a revelation. The doctrine of encirclement was familiar to the Germans. It was, to some extent, an intellectual heritage that stretched back to the campaigns of Frederick the Great, through the trenches of Verdun and culminating in the pockets of the Eastern Front. Cutting lines, isolating positions, blocking supplies and waiting for them to collapse through hunger, cold, or desperation. That was the logic. And Bastogne, from the point of view of the German High Command, offered all the conditions for this model. 7 crucial roads converged there. The terrain, surrounded by forests and elevations, made rapid reinforcements difficult, and the weather, with sub-zero temperatures and minimal visibility, seemed to be the perfect ally. General von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, articulated his strategy based on an almost mathematical expectation. If the Americans were surrounded and the skies closed, then surrender was only a matter of time. It was enough to maintain the perimeter, prevent infiltrations, and wait. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, alongside armored regiments of the 2nd Panzer, positioned itself meticulously around the city. The siege was closing with precision. By 12 noon on 21st December, all routes to Bastogne were under German control. At 6 p.m., the German situation maps themselves recorded the city as surrounded and contained. At the center of this encirclement were approximately 22,000 American soldiers, exhausted, poorly equipped, with no direct contact with the higher command and with limited logistical reserves. Among them, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, the Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various small detachments. For the German command, the situation was clear. The Americans were cornered. The inevitable comparison made by many officers at that time was with Stalingrad. Only this time, the positions were reversed. Now it was the West that faced its own miniature collapse. The analogy reinforced confidence. In 1942, the Luftwaffe failed to supply Paulus's Sixth Army by air. If Germany in its prime could not keep a force encircled, how would the United States do it now? The reasoning made sense, but it ignored two fundamental factors. First, the Luftwaffe in 1942 was already overstretched and in decline. Second, the Americans were not Germany. The assumption that weather would prevent any lasting aerial action was another critical error. In fact, between December 17th and 22, visibility was almost nil, with freezing fog and continuous snowfall. But Allied meteorologists had already forecast a significant improvement for the 23rd. German intelligence reports, however, did not seriously consider this possibility. With the skies locked for 6 days, the Germans made the wrong strategic decisions. The bulk of the armored forces were redirected to the advance toward the Meuse River, leaving Bastogne under the guard of infantry units and sparse reinforcements. The reasoning was simple. If the city could not be supplied and was surrounded, it would only be a matter of passive resistance. Bastogne would be conquered by the cold. Luttwitz, sure of his position, even sent a formal ultimatum demanding surrender, which would be answered with the word that echoes in history today: nuts. Dünn. The German operational vision was essentially based on a conception of war of physical attrition, seizing ground, cutting off supplies, and holding positions as if the enemy were unable to transcend space. It was a two-dimensional war. But the Americans were about to prove that they were fighting in 3 dimensions. The American doctrine of air support, which had been developing since North Africa, was no longer an occasional tactic. It was a complete system, articulated between logistics, meteorology, engineering, and transport aviation. And that system had reached maturity in 1944, with the consolidation of airfield networks, joint command, and a supply chain that spanned continents. Germany still transported ammunition in horse-drawn carts on several fronts. The United States used mechanized trains, industrial locomotives, and coordinated airdrops with millimeter precision. In Bastogne, the error of underestimation was not only technical, it was doctrinal. The German operational mindset did not consider the possibility that an army could sustain its combat capability without land contact. For Luttwitz and Kokott, resupplying a besieged force was a practical impossibility. They did not know that, at that point in the war, the United States produced a new C-47 transport plane every 63 minutes, on average. This statistic, absent in the German reports, would be costly, because in the early hours of the next morning, the engines of these planes were already warmed up, and what would come from the sky would not just be supply, it would be a message written in colored parachutes. The Americans were no longer playing by the rules of the old war. They were writing the news. The confession of a German officer years later would summarize what would come next. We surrounded Bastogne with men. They surrounded Bastogne with factories. The arrival of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne was not planned in advance, nor was it done under ideal conditions. When the German offensive broke through the Allied lines on the 16th December, the Screaming Eagles were at operational rest at Mourmelon, France. It was winter, and the division was still restructured after the intense fighting in Normandy and Operation Market Garden. Many of its soldiers were in training, some without their full winter gear, and almost all believed They would not be sent back to the front line before the new year. But in less than 24 hours, more than 5,000 men were mobilized in trucks, makeshift columns, and night convoys. They set out in haste without organic artillery, with a shortage of ammunition and heavy equipment, relying only on the accumulated experience, the weapons they carried, and the promise that reinforcements would come, sooner or later. When they reached the outskirts of Bastogne on the morning of December 18th, the city was still in Allied hands, but barely. German troops were advancing along the routes to the north and east, and the time to mount any kind of defense was minimal. The order was clear. Hold your position, no retreat, no alternatives. The men of the 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and units of engineers and anti-tanks, formed a horseshoe-shaped perimeter around the city, covering all strategic exits. They improvised trenches in the snow, set up observation posts with wood from destroyed houses, and used abandoned warehouses as improvised logistics centers. Combat Command B, under Colonel Joseph H. Harper, positioned its armored vehicles at critical entrances, while airborne infantry battalions took over the most vulnerable zones. There was no time for fortifications. The defensive line was made of flesh, steel, and conviction. And more than that, from memory. Many of those soldiers knew what it meant to fight under siege. They had seen Carentan, Sainte-Mère-Église, Eindhoven. They knew that in modern warfare, surviving an extra day could mean winning. What the German besiegers found, however, was something that ran counter to their moral calculations. They expected to find disorder and retreat. They met resistance. They expected a fragmented command. They found coordination. They expected the Americans to hesitate, but they shot. With precision, with control, with a coldness that did not match the situation. The first shock was not technical, but psychological. The sight of a supposedly cornered division, fighting with discipline, dismantled the narrative of German superiority. Bastogne, according to the plans of the High Command, should have fallen in 2 days. But by the end of the third, infiltration attempts had already been repelled in at least 5 different sectors. On some fronts, the Americans even counterattacked, even with a numerical outnumber of 5-1. For German officers on the ground, the situation was disconcerting. There was no logic in that. How could poorly equipped soldiers, surrounded with no visible reinforcements, manage to hold positions so effectively? The answer was not on the battlefield. It was more distant, invisible. It was in the factories of Detroit, in the training camps of Georgia, in the floating depots that supplied the Allied rear. It was in the engine of a war machine whose strength had not yet been fully understood. A technical detail highlights this abyss of perception. At the time Bastogne was surrounded, the United States had more than 8,000 transport planes operationally ready in the European theater. Germany, on the other hand, had just over 500 functional transport aircraft on the entire Western Front, and most of them without the ability to operate in contested areas. This number in itself anticipates what would come in the following days. If you still believe that war can be won only with courage, you may need to see what can be done with an air fleet 16 times larger. And the Germans were about to find out. The accounts of General Major Heinz Kokott himself, in interrogation after the war, reveal this moment of transition. In his words, the resistance in Bastogne seemed disproportionate to their material situation. We began to realize that something was wrong, not with them, but with us. The doctrine of concentrated force, of the lightning offensive, of perfect encirclement, collapsed in the face of what did not move. Because Bastogne did not advance, did not retreat, did not collapse. He just resisted. The first sign that the 101st would not fall did not come from the sky, nor from the supply lines. It came from the silence of the Americans when they received the ultimatum to surrender. A silence that, more than a refusal, was an affirmation. And that would soon be translated into an even clearer language, that of engines. Because on the morning of December 23rd, The sound that would echo through the icy hills of the Ardennes would no longer be that of explosions. It would be the coordinated roar of 241 aircraft emerging from the east in combat formation, and with them would come the definitive answer. Between December 16th and 22, 1944, the climate over the Ardennes became the most faithful of the German allies. Low skies, dense fog, constant snow and minimal visibility created a natural curtain over the offensive. For the first time since Normandy, panzer divisions were able to move into open field without looking up. It was as if winter itself had granted the Wehrmacht a truce against Allied air superiority. Narrow roads were filled with columns of armor, supply trucks, artillery pieces, and embarked infantry, which advanced without the threat of the dreaded P-47 fighters or the medium bomber squadrons. To the German generals, this seemed like a sign of fate. The Luftwaffe, unable to guarantee any effective cover, limited itself to short-range patrols. But during this frozen week, he was not needed. The absence of planes in the sky gave Germany the impression that the tide had turned. Bastogne was encircled in record time. Fragmented Allied units were repulsed, and the German Field Command began to consider that the encirclement could close for good before Christmas. Radio communications from the 47th Panzer Corps conveyed optimism. There was a real belief that if the weather window held for another 3 days, the city would collapse from exhaustion. The ground supply had been cut off, and the Americans, with rationed ammunition, seemed doomed to surrender. Meteorology, in this short interval, replaced the Luftwaffe as an instrument of tactical advantage, and this false balance, based on the clouds, anesthetized the perception of reality. No German risk analysis includes the hypothesis of a large-scale air logistics counterattack. What the generals called American immobility was actually strategic containment. America's real weapon, supremacy in the air, was just waiting, awaiting an element that no general could control: the sun. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The absence of planes did not mean weakness, it meant only postponement, and while the German troops advanced with the illusion of advantage, behind the scenes, the American machinery kept turning. On British soil, dozens of airfields remained on standby, C-47 crews were training for night launches, and gliders were being prepared for critical missions. The rescue operation would not be improvised. It was already written. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and reveal what the war maps didn't show. Bastogne was silent. The radios crackled with intermittent signals. Reports indicated that the encircled troops were at their limit, but the American response would not come to an end. And it wouldn't come with tanks. It would come from a dimension above. Because on the morning of December 23rd, time gave way, and the sky opened. What would come next would not be a resupply mission. It would be the collapse of an entire doctrine. On the morning of December 22nd, 1944, with Bastogne fully surrounded, German commanders felt they were on the verge of victory. From the high command to the front line, the perception was unanimous. The Americans were exhausted, isolated, and facing collapse. The 7 roads that connected the city had been cut with surgical precision. Supplies were scarce, and winter was quietly doing its job. Confidently, General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps ordered a parliamentary group to be sent to the American front. 4 German soldiers marched through the snow with white flags in hand, following the Arlen Road, carrying a briefcase with an ultimatum of surrender written in 2 languages. The scene was carefully orchestrated. The Germans hoped that the formal ritual would reinforce the idea of inevitability. The officer in charge, a major of the Wehrmacht, presented himself with dignity and composure. The folder was delivered with protocols followed to the millimeter. In the mind of the German High Command, this was not just a demand, it was a final courtesy, an invitation to honorable surrender before the inevitable massacre. The answer would come shortly after. When the document was delivered to U.S. headquarters, General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read the message, gave a brief laugh and exclaimed, "Nuts!" somewhere between "you're crazy" and "no way." The officer in charge of drafting the response hesitated, suggesting a more formal formulation. McAuliffe, with a nod, insisted, "Just write this down." The message was then returned to the Germans, who were completely baffled. The German translator had difficulty explaining the expression. It took an American official to clarify. It means the same as "go to hell." The refusal of a word, almost comical, unassuming, and at the same time blunt, revealed something that German commanders had not considered. The Americans, even surrounded, hungry and cold, were not only willing to resist, they scoffed at the possibility of surrender. For German doctrine forged in concepts of honor, discipline, and strategic encirclement, the answer was a riddle. Lutwitz, a veteran of the 1940 campaigns, understood the classic codes of war. When a force was surrounded, out of supplies, and outnumbered 5-1, there was only one rational conclusion: surrender. Bastogne should follow this model. What he saw was an anomaly. That one-word answer, dry, informal, and insolent, not only contradicted tactical logic, it tore up the manuals. The theatrical confidence of the German command began to suffer fissures. The assumption that the siege was already won, that the American defeat was only a matter of time, was put in check by a symbolic detail: the enemy was still laughing. Irony cut through the air as coldly as the wind in the Ardennes. Soldiers who barely had blankets to sleep on, who had lost men to cold and hunger, reacted with derision to a formal ultimatum from the Wehrmacht. This was no longer just a military operation. It was a clash of mentalities. German doctrine expected strict discipline, blind obedience, and progressive collapse under pressure. What he found on the other side was improvisation, sarcasm, and a kind of resilience that was not in the intelligence reports. And if the American response seemed absurd, what would come the next day would completely defy the logic of war of the besiegers. A German general, interrogated after the war, would confess, "We offered honorable surrender. They were surrounded. It was irrational to refuse. At that moment I understood that we were not just facing soldiers, but an entire civilization armed with optimism." Because while the German command was drafting documents and designing starvation tables, the United States Air Transport Command was already tuning the engines. They knew that a parachute storm would come, and when it did, it wouldn't be a relief operation. It would be a declaration of logistical impossibility for the enemy. Bastogne would not fall, and the sky, until then silent, would soon speak. The dawn of December 23rd, 1944, started differently in Bastogne. For the first time in a week, the sky over the Ardennes was clear, cut by streaks of light filtered through thin clouds. Temperatures remained brutal, snow still covered the fields, but the natural curtain that had protected the Germans had disappeared. At 11:45 a.m., a still indistinct sound began to reverberate over the hills, low, continuous, metallic. First, a distant noise, then a buzzing sound that grew like a wave. German soldiers on the outer lines, positioned with binoculars at high points, rolled their eyes to the horizon and froze. What they saw was something that no doctrine, no manual, no general had prepared to interpret. 241 C-47 Dakota planes, flying in dense and coordinated formation, approaching like a moving wall. The scene was as unexpected as it was quietly devastating. The transport models, large, slow, unarmed, crossed the skies with absolute confidence, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts in protective maneuvers. The mouths of the German anti-aircraft guns spun and fired, but the altitude was too high, the targets were too many, and the results were nil. When the compartments opened, the skies over Bastogne were filled with color. Green, yellow, red, and white parachutes began to sprout like inverted flowers in the frozen air. They did not bring soldiers. They brought everything a besieged garrison could need: grenades, 30 and 50 ammunition, dehydrated food, blood plasma, field radios, spare parts, thermal blankets, maintenance tools, collapsible cannons. Each package was tracked by exact coordinates. U.S. recovery teams, previously deployed, were running under fire to collect the material. What the Germans saw from the outside was something that broke the logic of the siege. To them, the city was doomed. No access, no route, no salvation. But there, before his eyes, Bastogne received reinforcements without having to break through any line. The siege, technically, was still closed. But now it was irrelevant. For the first time in modern military history, a besieged division had become operationally functional on air supply alone. This wasn't a bailout. It was a reboot. Within hours, the 101st Airborne was not only refueled, it was rearmed. General McAuliffe's radio came back to life. The ammunition returned to their positions. The medical centers have resumed transfusions. The artillery resumed its pace. A German officer described the scene years later as the proof that our idea of war had died on that white field. Because, until that moment, the Germans still believed in the logic of hunger, of encirclement, of surrender by pressure. What they saw was an enemy that had escalated, an army that not only resisted, but reappeared with more force in the midst of the snow by the work of a logistical power that operated in another dimension. The Luftwaffe, for its part, watched paralyzed. With only a few dozen fighters available in the region and without enough fuel for extended missions, their presence was symbolic. Only two Focke-Wulf FW-190s managed to intercept the C-47s that morning, both shot down by P-51 escorts. The reality was undeniable. Air supremacy was total. The logistical superiority, absolute, and German morale, until then firm, began to crumble in silence. In the trenches and observation positions, many soldiers watched without knowing what to do. The bullets were no longer useful. The maps no longer explained. Surrounding Bastogne had proved to be a serious strategic mistake, because what seemed to be a trap for the Americans became the stage for the most daring show of logistical force ever made. And what the Germans saw wasn't just the enemy holding its own, it was the enemy thriving. In just 6 hours, more than 144 tons of supplies had been delivered. At the end of 48 hours, this number would exceed 800 tons. This meant that each man in the 101st would receive, on average, more than 35 kilograms of reinforcement, without a single land supply line having been re-established. If you believed the siege was a sentence, the United States proved that it could answer with math. Because in that war, who had the most parachutes won. And that would not be the only lesson of that day. Because while the planes returned to England in perfect formation, the American command was already preparing another surprise. An operation that would involve improvised runways, gliders and landings inside the combat zone. And when that happened, the besiegers would finally understand. The war had changed, and they had fallen behind. In German eyes, each parachute that fell on Bastogne was not just a package, it was an insult. The operation of December 23rd had been just the beginning. In the following days, a precision aerial choreography began to be repeated with mathematical regularity. The C-47s flew in successive blocks, dropping supplies every few hours. In all, in less than 5 days, more than 850 tons of material were delivered. It wasn't just about ammunition and food. The Americans have released blood plasma for transfusions, medicines, field radios, spare parts for 105mm howitzers, spare tubes for anti-tank guns, winter suits, waterproof leather boots, portable generators, and even complete surgical units packed into modules. What the farmers witnessed in real time was a 3D logistics operations manual. A plan that did not consider physical barriers as limits, only as temporary obstacles. On the German side, The comparison was painful. Supply columns largely relied on poor roads, with a third of logistics still being pulled by horses. Yes, horses, in 1944. Germany, worn out and exhausted by years of war, still kept about 1.1 million animals in logistical service. The United States, on the other hand, produced in that same month more than 2,500 GMC CCKW trucks per week. And these trucks were accompanied by fuel, tires, spare parts and field maintenance, something that did not exist in the German model. The contrast was so brutal that not even silence could disguise it. Deep in the forest, soldiers from the 26th Volksgrenadier heard the plane's engines and saw the parachutes descending, and with them their own morale plummeted. It was like watching one's own doctrine age in real time, because while the generals drew siege maps, the Americans drew airlines. And they won. One piece of data summarizes this asymmetry. Between December 1944 and January 1945, the United States dropped more supplies on Bastogne than the entire Luftwaffe had been able to transport to the Eastern Front in the previous 6 months. If this statistic surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because she won, not in maps, but in numbers, not in the speeches, but in the engines. War was no longer decided by the best-trained division, but by the nation with the greatest capacity to sustain the improbable. While Germany reduced its aviation production due to a lack of aluminum and synthetic fuel, the United States operated 96 aircraft factories on a 3-shift basis. While the Germans transported cartridges in wagons, the Americans dropped boxes of ammunition by gravity with individual parachutes by caliber type. It was a war between the past and the present. And the present flew in formation. The psychological effect of this imbalance was not limited to the material field. German doctrine, centered on tactical mobility, maneuver, and operational discipline, was beginning to crumble in the face of an enemy that, even at a standstill, seemed to be advancing. Because Bastogne did not back down. And more than that, it grew. With each new release, the city resisted more. With each supply, he gained momentum. With each fall of a parachute, a siege broke down, not on the map, but in the minds of the besiegers. In an internal report of the German General Staff, intercepted after the war, the following sentence is written: "The encircled enemy has become invulnerable. We no longer fight soldiers, we fight against flying deposits." It was the symbolic surrender of an entire doctrine, because it was no longer enough to conquer ground. It was necessary to conquer the sky. And that Germany could no longer do. However, what would come next would make it clear that the Americans were still not satisfied with keeping Bastogne alive. They intended to do more, much more, because in the shadows of airfields in France, gliders were being lined up, and makeshift lanes were being opened in the heart of the besieged city. If until now the Germans had seen boxes flying, now they would see planes landing. The diaries and reports captured after the war reveal a curious pattern among the German troops surrounding Bastogne. Silence. A silence that settled in the trenches after the days of aerial refueling, not as a tactic, but as resignation. In the words of a sergeant of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, "We heard the planes, we saw the parachutes, and we knew that everything was lost." But no one said anything. The Wehrmacht, forged to advance with armored maneuvers, now found itself standing motionless, watching an enemy operation take place over its heads without any real ability to react. It was like watching an inevitable spectacle. The anti-aircraft artillery fell silent, the Luftwaffe did not take off, and the officers no longer spoke of offensive, but of containment. The siege, previously treated with arrogance, has become a logistical and moral burden. The German structure, which operated on long and fragile landlines, could not keep up with its own advance. Meanwhile, Americans were feeding an entire city by air with time accuracy. At one point in the siege, observers reported launches so regular that they became part of the routine. In the morning, the fighters came. In the afternoon, transport. At dusk, silence. But that silence was no longer strategic. It was psychological. Bastogne was no longer a military objective. It was an uncomfortable reminder that Germany was fighting with tools of the past against a machine of the future. What should have been a symbolic victory had become a showcase of inferiority. German officers began to adapt their orders based on the new reality. They avoided direct confrontations with the resupplied positions, redirected efforts to peripheral sectors, and on some fronts simply stagnated. A company commander noted in an almost clinical tone, "We continue with the siege as a formality. The military function has disappeared." Bastogne, in German eyes, was no longer a besieged fortress. It was a flying fortress, fueled by a logistical empire with almost unlimited reserves. The statistics circulating among Allied officials further deepened this feeling. The United States had produced 16,000 C-47s during the war. Of these, more than 10,000 were in full operation by the end of 1944. This meant that, if necessary, the Americans could simultaneously supply up to 20 cities like Bastogne. The effect of this observation was destructive to enemy morale. Courage, previously seen as an asset, was no longer enough. Because it wasn't about bravery anymore. It was about range, scale, and replenishment. The perception among Wehrmacht soldiers changed from offensive posture to simple resistance to time. They knew they wouldn't win Bastogne. The most they could do was delay the inevitable. The psychological weight of this tactical failure spread like frozen fog among the German positions. An infantry captain reported that his men spoke no more of victory, only from the cold and from heaven. Because the sky, for them, had become a symbol of impotence. What was once the domain of the Luftwaffe now belonged to another empire, and there was nothing they could do. The war in that siege was no longer a dispute for territory. It was an exhibition, and the Americans had set the stage with surgical precision. But what the siegers did not yet know was that, in addition to refueling, the United States was about to open an airstrip in the heart of the siege. And there, no more parachutes would fall. Engines would fall. On the same day that transport planes flew over Bastogne, dropping tons of supplies over the besieged city, the skies over the entire region took on a darker, deadlier hue. The first P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, known as Razorbacks, began appearing on German lines, creating a sudden but devastating transition. What until then had seemed to be an air truce, a strategic pause where the Luftwaffe could move with relative freedom, quickly turned into a nightmare. The morning sun, on December 23rd, had already revealed the refueling planes. But now he illuminated the terror of American fighters. The P-47s began to attack in waves, flying at low altitudes, making low sprints less than 30 meters from the ground. With powerful 2,000 horsepower engines and heavy armament, these fighters were immune to most close-range artillery attacks. Armed with 12.7mm machine guns and 70mm rockets, they became tireless predators. The goal was not just to destroy tanks or armored vehicles. The target now was the supply routes, the German columns that had ventured west, seeking to regroup and strengthen the encirclement. Every transport movement, every stretch of road seemed to be a trap for the German forces. Within hours, the P-47s had decimated entire columns, turning what had once been safe routes into deadly corridors. The flow of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements was interrupted with the precision of aerial surgery. Where once there was confidence and freedom of movement, there was now panic. The confidence of previous weeks, fueled by the expectation of an imminent victory, has given way to operational stagnation. German soldiers, previously concerned only with encirclement, were now being attacked from a direction they had neglected. The fear of looking up, something the Germans had not experienced since Normandy, turned into a visceral and disconcerting sensation. Even the camouflaged positions, well hidden among trees and snow, were attacked with surgical precision. American planes hunted everything that moved: supply trucks, armored tanks, even small infantry units. It was a return to the primal fear of Allied aircraft, the same terror that had dogged German forces during the months of invasion in France. And while this was happening, German officers could not help but realize what was at stake. Bastogne would not just be a military failure. It would be a reminder of the disparity that existed between the two powers. While Germany struggled with obsolete vehicles and logistics were limited to horses and trucks, the United States not only resupplied its forces by air, but now began to dominate the air battlefield with overwhelming superiority. The war, for the Germans, became increasingly difficult to deal with. The realization that they were fighting with a power that possessed unlimited industrial capacity, as well as overwhelming air power, began to crystallize as a profound psychological blow. The war, for Germany, had become something more complex than simple tactical maneuvers. There was a scale factor that they could no longer ignore. American superiority was unquestionable and revealed in every air attack, in every destroyed supply line, in every plane that descended from the sky, not with bombs, but with the promise that the war was still far from over. For the besiegers of Bastogne, defeat was only a matter of time, and for Germans, the numbers were starting to become alarming. If they could no longer dominate the skies, how could they maintain a battlefront against an enemy that seemed to be getting stronger and stronger, even surrounded? Before long, the irony of the situation became clear. The encirclement was unraveling, not by a breakout or a breach in the line, but by a factor they could not control: the American industrial ability to keep an army supplied, equipped, and ready to fight. And what would come next, when the siege was finally broken, would reveal something even more surprising. Bastogne, in 1944, was a distorted mirror of the Blitzkrieg that Germany had used to conquer France in 1940. The same tactic of rapid encirclement, surprise and speed, which had been a decisive weapon for the Wehrmacht, turned against it in a manner as ironic as it was devastating. In 1940, the Germans used their armored forces, their speed of movement and air superiority to crush French defenses within weeks. They relied on the ability to maneuver quickly, surprise, and encircle. The attack was a display of technical efficiency, where Germany demonstrated their ability to execute coordinated movements with precision. However, in 1944, reality had changed irreversibly. The siege of Bastogne, which was supposed to be just another step in the German offensive, exposed a deep structural flaw in the military approach of Hitler and his generals. What should have been an efficient siege of an isolated city became a bitter lesson in the industrial and logistical capacity of the United States. Where once speed and maneuver were the keys to success, now paralysis and scarcity have defined German reality. Instead of encircling the Americans and waiting for collapse, Germany now found itself embroiled in a struggle to hold its own front line. Where the tanks and elite soldiers had been, there were now only congested rows of vehicles, many of them slow and vulnerable. The Battle of Bastogne turned the tables not only in terms of tactics, but in terms of mentality. The mobility and dynamism that had been the great forces of the Blitzkrieg were neutralized by the siege itself. The surprise was overcome by American determination, which not only resisted but advanced in its ability to maintain a force surrounded indefinitely. And the Germans' worst nightmare was in full formation: aerial refueling. Bastogne, which was supposed to be a repeat of Dunkirk, an inevitable retreat, a cornered defeat, set the stage for an unexpected revival of American strength through logistical engineering, not courage in the trenches. The historical contrast between the great victory of 1940 and the failure of 1944 was atrociously clear. Where German maneuvering power and speed had conquered France within weeks, the inability to hold the battle in 1944 exposed a stark truth. Germany was no longer fighting like a modern power. Bastogne became the evidence that the future of war no longer lay in who maneuvered more agilely, but in who could produce and sustain. While the United States used its industrial supremacy to resupply Bastogne from the skies, the Wehrmacht relied on limited logistics, agreements with plundered countries, vulnerable railroads, and methods that no longer worked. And the statistic that all Germans began to realize, however reluctantly, was this: the United States produced more trucks in a week than Germany produced in a month. Bastogne, therefore, was not just a besieged city. It was the scene of the historical reversal where Germany was defeated, not because of a lack of bravery or skill on the battlefield, but because of the obsolescence of its doctrine and the lack of logistical resources needed to sustain a modern war. Victory was no longer on the battlefield, but in the ability to make an entire war sustain itself day after day. Production, logistics, technology, all of this converged in a demonstration of power. For the Germans, the war was no longer won by encirclement or maneuver. It was being decided by the industry. And this, relentlessly, began to show who was really in control of the future of the war. The comparison with Dunkirk and Stalingrad, two battles that had marked Germany's destiny, revealed the ultimate truth. The Germany of 1944 was far from the power of 1940. She was no longer modern, but a shadow pressed by the weight of the past. The future, in this case, belonged to those who could produce, to those who had the resources to sustain a protracted war. The US victory at Bastogne was being secured not by its tactics in the field, but by the mass production that allowed any operation, no matter how long, to continue. And with that, the war took a different turn. The siege of Bastogne would become the great lesson of Germany's ideological collapse. But what would follow would be an even more difficult turn of events for German commanders to digest. The siege of Bastogne was about to be broken, and the responsibility for it would come from a direction they could never have imagined. The aerial refueling at Bastogne was not just a one-off operation. It was the manifestation of a revolution in the concept of a war of position. For centuries, sieges were the way to force a city to surrender, isolate, cut off supplies, wait. The logic was simple. Without food, ammunition, and reinforcements, the city capitulated. For the Germans, Bastogne was a classic example of this principle. An isolated city, without contact with the rest of the Allied lines, would inevitably have to surrender. But the United States has rewritten that formula with an approach never before seen in military history: air logistics. For the first time, a besieged and isolated city was not forced into submission for lack of supplies. Rather, it was kept in operation with a steady flow of resources from the skies. More than 1,000 C-47 planes took part in the refueling, flying from bases scattered across Western Europe. Aerial refueling became the backbone of American resistance, a technological solution that simply did not exist in the German military repertoire. The aircraft flew with surgical precision, coordinated by a complex air planning system supported by intelligence units, launch zone guides, and specialized crews who ensured that each payload was dropped in the right place at the right time. Launch pads were distributed throughout France and even the United Kingdom, with planes ready to depart at a moment's notice, equipped with variable payloads that met every possible need of a surrounded force. More than 15,000 artillery shells were launched. More than 8,000 gallons of gasoline were poured on the ground of Bastogne. Medicine, food, artillery pieces, winter clothes, everything parachuted down, delivering exactly what the defenders needed. The conceptual change that this entailed was enormous. The Americans, by making use of their air supremacy, turned the siege into a game of who can go on the longest, not with weaponry or physical attrition, but with the ability to keep an army supplied while surrounded. This defied the very logic of positional warfare, as aerial refueling became a repeatable strategy, no longer an exception. The sky was no longer a threat to be avoided, it was now the main line of supply. For Germany, which still relied heavily on railroad tracks, scarce fuel, and motorized columns that came and went with great difficulty, the idea of using the sky as a supply line seemed more like a science fiction tale. The use of transport planes to resupply a besieged city was something that German generals had never considered, let alone implemented. They could not imagine that air logistics could be such a powerful, effective weapon. At the same time, the industrial empire of the United States showed its superiority, not with military maneuvers, but with mass production. Compared to the Germans, who were facing critical shortages of fuel and material, the United States had a capacity to resupply forces on the move that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht could produce. When the war began, Germany had the advantage of a more agile industry, of an army that moved fast, but that advantage was eroded for one simple reason. The United States had found a way to play the war with more resources. It was no longer about speed or maneuvering. It was industrial power. The Germans, in attempting to encircle Bastogne, had no idea that they were, in fact, providing their own defeat. They surrounded a city, but air logistics didn't just break the siege. It redefined the very concept of siege. America was no longer fighting under the same conditions as Germany. They were flying above the war, literally controlling the battlefield through a logistical infrastructure that the Germans simply couldn't reach. And this was about to become even clearer to the German commanders, who saw their positions being weakened, not by the heat of battle, but by the inability to achieve the production needed to sustain the offensive. If you think the power of American logistics is incredible, comment below. Absolute power. That's what the Americans were demonstrating in Bastogne. A power that was not just military, but industrial, logistical, and unbeatable. But what would come next would forever change the Germans' view of the war. They would understand that in a conflict like this, victory was not a matter of winning battles, but of who had the most capacity to supply their forces, no matter the situation. And the next chapter of that story would show the lengths to which the American war machine was willing to go to break the final stand. As transport planes flew over Bastogne, dropping supplies essential to keeping American forces in combat, another crucial element of the operation began to unfold, a component often overlooked in military narratives, but one that was vital to the survival of thousands of men: medical care. The siege of Bastogne, with its horrors and its isolation, was not won with arms and ammunition alone. He was also defeated with blood, plasma, and scalpels. As refueling planes delivered ammunition and food, other planes, these slightly more specialized, began to do the same, but with a very different load. American gliders were launched over the city, bringing complete surgical units, doctors, nurses, and sophisticated equipment to deal with the wounded. They were equipped with all the items needed to care for hundreds of soldiers: chilled blood, plasma bags, surgical instruments, and perhaps most importantly, the medical expertise to perform the potentially life-saving surgeries. These gliders landed in makeshift zones where conditions were anything but ideal, but they still allowed the American war machine to also take care of its soldiers as effectively as it fed and resupplied them. For the doctors, nurses, and rescue workers, the siege was a test of endurance, but also of precision and humanity. In the midst of snow and fire, the Americans were able to operate and save lives more effectively than any other army had ever done in a siege before. In stark contrast to this reality, Germany found itself in a desperate situation. While the Americans sent complete surgical units by gliders, wounded German soldiers were treated in a rudimentary way. There was no adequate material. There was no anesthesia in many cases, and many of the surgeries were done under primitive conditions. Air evacuation of the wounded, a common practice among Allied forces, was non-existent on the German side. Wounded German soldiers were often treated with makeshift bandages, or in the worst case, left for dead on the battlefield. This disparity became even more evident on the front lines. Modern warfare, which had previously been concerned with the amount of destruction, was now defined by who had the ability to save lives. War was no longer just about killing better, but also about saving better. And in this respect, the United States was once again ahead. For the Germans, this was a devastating reality. They were fighting not only against a stronger army, but against a society that possessed a medical infrastructure capable of sustaining its forces even in the worst conditions. The contrast was clear. While American soldiers received cutting-edge medical treatment, the Germans, still relying on improvised solutions, began to realize that war was no longer decided only on the battlefield, but also on the ability to sustain human strength for longer. American superiority lay not only in its ability to mass manufacture planes and vehicles, but also in its ability to care for its men in a way that, to the Germans, seemed unimaginable. American technology, although focused on combat efficiency, also had a human facet, which placed the preservation of life as a fundamental part of its doctrine. The war of the future was shaping itself not only in terms of destruction, but also in terms of preservation. The American war machine was not only ruthless in combat, but also effective in saving lives, providing its soldiers with the opportunity to continue fighting. And this factor, although often ignored, became a powerful weapon. As the Germans wallowed in their logistical and medical limitations, the United States continued to show its ability not only to win, but to wage war in a more humane and effective way. But as the warfare on the battlefield became increasingly asymmetrical, a new phase was about to begin. The siege of Bastogne wasn't simply broken by supplies or weapons. It was about to be broken by an empire's air force. And soon, Americans would no longer need to release supply packages. They would bring their forces into the siege, using a strategy that could only be done by those who had the means to operate in any terrain, at any time. What would follow would not only be a military victory, but a reaffirmation that, in modern warfare, the power to sustain and preserve life was, in fact, the greatest differentiator. After the December 23rd aerial refueling, the German commanders surrounding Bastogne began to realize that the encirclement, which initially seemed like a guaranteed victory, was crumbling. It was no longer a question of military tactics. What was unfolding before them was a psychological and strategic breakdown that they could not explain. During post-war interrogations, many German intelligence officers confessed their bewilderment at what they had witnessed. The scale of the American operation and the continued sustainment of the 101st Airborne Division defied any rational explanation. They were no longer just surrounding a city, they were confronting an industrial force that surpassed anything they had imagined. German soldiers, many of them war-hardened veterans, looked at the descending parachutes and saw them not as symbols of support, but as colorful insults. To them, every package that fell from the sky was a reminder of their powerlessness. The weight of the situation was reflected in their memories, and many described the feeling of being trapped in a war that was no longer won with bravery or strategy, but with infinite machines and resources. The words of a German soldier in a field diary were clear. "We can no longer go against the machine that swallows us. Each parachute is a reminder that our fight is no longer against men, but against an immense, relentless cog. A gear that can provide the enemy with everything he needs, while we are left without fuel, without morale, and without hope." General Kokot himself, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reported after the war his astonishment at the efficiency of the Americans' logistics system. In his words, "I never imagined that a siege like that would be transformed into a lesson in impotence. When the planes started to arrive, I realized that we were no longer fighting an army. We were fighting against an empire, and we didn't know how to defeat him." For Cocotte and many of his officers, the experience at Bastogne was a profound and humbling shock. They had underestimated the industrial capacity of the United States, believing that the Americans depended on an army of soldiers, just as the Germans did. But what they were up against was a power powered by fuel, steel, and a determination fueled by a modern, unbeatable war machine. Every tank, every plane, every truck that the Germans tried to destroy was replaced almost instantly, without them being able to stop it. For soldiers on the front lines, the reality became increasingly clear. They were fighting not against a human force, but against a logistical cog that moved resources and kept the Americans operating steadily. A machine that didn't stop, a machine that didn't need rest. And on the battlefield, the disparity was even more cruel. While the Germans used horses to transport ammunition and fuel, the Americans had planes that flew over the war. For German officers and soldiers, it was a hard truth to swallow. They were fighting with rifles, horses, and makeshift gear, while the enemy was armed with machines that could refuel, provide spare parts, and maintain troop morale, all without leaving the sky. And the most painful thing was that the Germans were being defeated by a logic that they did not understand and could not reproduce: the superiority of industrial mass production. What General Cocotte realized later was that the war was no longer a contest of brute force. American superiority was not just in the number of soldiers or maneuverability, but in a structural capacity to sustain a war indefinitely. In the view of a German intelligence officer during an interrogation, he vented, "Our failure was to believe that the war was won by the courage of soldiers. What the Americans showed us was that the war, in the end, is won by the ability to supply, to continue feeding the force. They didn't need to win in terms of men or tactics. They had the means to ensure that their men never grew weary. And we, with all our past glories, are powerless." The psychological impact of this accomplishment was profound. The siege of Bastogne was not only a military defeat for the Germans, but an exposure of the bankruptcy of their own doctrine of war. The Blitzkrieg, which had previously been unbeatable for its speed and surprise, was now overshadowed by the ability of an enemy that depended not on speed, but on a constant and uninterrupted supply. The clash was not only tactical, it was ideological. War was no longer a question of who had the best strategy or the best soldiers. It was a question of who could continue fighting longer, with more resources. The perception of powerlessness began to spread through the German high command. The pressure to continue the siege dropped dramatically, and the morale of the troops deteriorated with each new parachute that descended, with each new artillery bombardment that approached. Germany was being defeated by its inability to maintain the war on a modern scale, against a war machine that was already operating in a different dimension. But the worst was yet to come. The siege of Bastogne was about to be broken, and the reason for this would be even more devastating for the Germans. For the Americans not only had the means to resist, they were about to show how, with their superior infrastructure, they could turn a siege line into a corridor of victory. On the cold morning of December 25, 1944, the German command, with its last letter in hand, began the final attack against Bastogne. After days of waiting and preparation, panzer tanks, followed by infantry troops, advanced toward the American lines, confident that they could finally break through resistance and conquer the city. For the first time since the siege, it seemed possible to the Germans that Bastogne might fall. The armored units, already tattered for some time by shortages of fuel and spare parts, began the assault with the intention of crushing the American defenses and restoring the momentum of their offensive. For a few minutes, the tank columns managed to briefly break through the defense lines of the 101st Airborne Division, which were scattered in makeshift positions around the city. However, the breakthrough that looked promising was quickly halted. Instead of retreating in disorder, as the Germans had anticipated, the American units reacted immediately and fiercely. The newly dropped ammunition for the paratroopers and support units was quickly employed. American armored personnel carriers, such as the M10 and M18, now fueled and ready for fight, began to move into position, offering resistance without hesitation. Most importantly, the soldiers of the 101st had their morale intact, and the American leadership, especially at lower command levels, showed an aggressiveness that belied any expectation of collapse. The American response was not only strategic, it was coordinated, precise, and effective. The German tanks, which initially seemed to have the numerical and tactical advantage, were shot down one by one as they trudged through the snow, trying to break through the defensive lines. Every tank destroyed was a logistical headache for the Germans, and every American anti-tank unit that emerged from the frozen terrain led to more losses. Within hours, the first German attack groups were being forced to withdraw. Throughout the day, the American resistance became more than just a simple defense. It turned into a counterattack where aggressiveness and control of the battlefield were in American hands. To the Germans, what seemed like a decisive blow now turned out to be a nightmare of frustration and despair. For each advance, the Americans responded with more force, more precision, and above all, more resources. By the end of the day, all German tanks that had taken part in the attack were destroyed. The siege of Bastogne, far from relenting, had become a new defeat for the attackers. What was supposed to be a strategic triumph for Germany turned into a tactical and moral embarrassment. It wasn't American courage or heroism that had caused the attack to collapse. It was the supply. The Americans resisted because their supplies kept arriving, non-stop, fed by an air logistics network that was never interrupted. For the Germans, this was an impossible reality to combat. Throughout the day, reports multiplied among the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht. Bastogne would not fall. The final attack had failed. The last chance for victory in the Ardennes offensive had been squandered. The German command, which already had its hopes of breaking through the American lines, began to realize the gravity of the situation. It would no longer be possible to conquer Bastogne, let alone advance towards Antwerp or any other strategic objective. More than that, the siege had already revealed the true nature of war. It was no longer won by maneuver or willpower alone. It was decided by the ability to supply, by the ability to keep troops on the battlefield with morale and resources. The Germans had no way to combat this anymore. The siege was broken not by a miracle or the bravery of a single battalion, but by the strength of American logistics, which the Germans could no longer fight. When the last German attack was repulsed and the dust of battle finally began to settle, the German High Command had to face a perplexing truth. The war would not be won by force of arms, but by the ability to keep fighting, keeping the forces supplied. American industrial production had given the U.S. Army an insurmountable advantage. The winter of 1944 was not yet over, but for the Germans, the siege of Bastogne had signed its sentence. The rest of the battle was no longer a question of who had the best army or the best strategy. It was a question of who could endure the longest, and the Americans had shown that in this respect they were unattainable. And the worst was yet to come for the Germans. Soon the Allied advance toward Germany would begin, and the Wehrmacht would have to contend not only with endless supplies from the Americans, but with the overwhelming force of an empire that was on the march. On the cold afternoon of December 26, 1944, The harrowing wait that surrounded Bastogne finally came to an end. George S. Patton's 4th Armored Division, known for its relentless aggressiveness, broke through the German siege lines and entered the besieged city. The siege of Bastogne, which had lasted more than a week, was broken. But what could have been a simple military victory became something much more significant. The encounter between Patton's armored vehicles and the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne was not only a relief for the isolated troops. It was confirmation that American doctrine, a combination of aggression on the ground and continuity in the air, not only worked, but was overcoming the limitations of traditional warfare. For the Germans, what seemed like a certain victory quickly turned into a devastating blow. Through transport planes, gliders, and armored units, the United States had kept an entire city alive, active, and combatant, even at the height of the siege. American logistics had proved unbeatable. Patton's final attack, though hampered by extreme weather and German ambushes along the way, was a symbol of accuracy and capability. The 4th Armored Division advanced along the frozen roads, facing heavy snowfall and complicated terrain. However, the goal was clear: to break the siege and reach Bastogne at any cost. The severe winter and lack of visibility caused immense problems, but the willpower of Patton's troops was even more intense. As Patton's tank columns advanced, the Germans, aware of the impending arrival of American reinforcements, attempted to set traps and block the roads. But his forces were stretched, overwhelmed by a lack of fuel and spare parts. What Patton brought was more than just brute force. It brought coordination and focus. Upon reaching the German lines, Patton did not hesitate. He gave the Wehrmacht no chance to regroup. The armored divisions advanced rapidly, using the strength and weight of the tanks to destroy any obstacles, break the lines, and secure passage. At the same time, as the battle unfolded, the air over Bastogne did not stop. C-47 planes continued to fly overhead, resupplying the city and ensuring that the supply line was never interrupted, even as ground reinforcements arrived. The siege was broken by a perfect alliance between land and air, a combination of aggression on the ground and the logistical power of the skies. The psychological effect was profound, not only for the defenders, but also for the besiegers. When Patton and his armored vehicles finally reached the center of Bastogne, the city was greeted with applause and enthusiasm, but also with a clear understanding of what had just happened. The Americans were not just breaking a siege, they were reaffirming what was already clear. The United States not only possessed military power, but also the ability to sustain it in a way that Germany, with its outdated tactics, could not even imagine. Within days, Bastogne, which seemed like a symbol of American resistance, became a symbol of how modern warfare would be won, not with greater numbers of soldiers or daring maneuvers, but with logistics and innovation, with a supply system that left no room for failure. For the Germans, this was a fatal blow to their morale and their expectations. They had underestimated American industrial capacity. The broken encirclement was the perfect illustration that the United States could not only hold out in a protracted war, but win, as its ability to continue operating was unmatched. And the impact of this was profound. The war was tilting once and for all in favor of the Allies. The next steps would be retaliation, the advance into the heart of Germany, and the confirmation that victory was no longer just about who dominated the terrain, but who had the best capacity to sustain the fight. And when Patton crossed the siege lines, the sound of his tanks roaring through the streets of Bastogne was not just the sound of victory. It was the sound of a war that would soon come to an end. Numbers never lie. And in the case of the siege of Bastogne, they speak of an irrefutable superiority that could not be ignored. During the crucial days between December 23rd and 26, 1944, more than 1,113 tons of supplies were airdropped to the American defenders. These numbers include 15,000 artillery shells, 8,000 gallons of gasoline, more than 250,000 food rations, and even complete surgical units. The logistical accuracy was so impressive that for each soldier, there was an average of 35 kilograms of materials delivered, keeping the 101st Airborne Division not only alive, but at full operational capacity. To put this in perspective, the Germans who surrounded Bastogne had only 54,000 men in the region, with no aerial refueling capabilities and with virtually zero air force. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched and exhausted, could no longer support the troops in the field. Meanwhile, the United States operated with more than 15,000 planes in combat condition. The production of airplanes and vehicles in the United States was 10 times greater than the production capacity of all of Germany. For the Germans, the comparison was impossible to ignore. They were at war with a power whose production capacity was unlimited, while their own factories lay in ruins. When the Americans kept Bastogne supplied with this effectiveness, the siege was not only broken, the war was decided. It was no longer a conflict of tactics or bravery. The war was being resolved in the boardroom and in the factories, far from the front lines. The Americans were able to sustain their war effort non-stop. The Germans, on the other hand, were exhausted, unable to replace losses of vehicles, weapons, and most crucially, supplies. There was no contingency plan. There were no factories in a position to withstand a prolonged war effort. The siege of Bastogne, which had begun with blind optimism on the part of the Germans, was defeated not by heroic battles, but by the simple fact that the United States could keep its forces in operation while the Germans were on the verge of logistical collapse. Modern warfare is not solved only in the trenches, but in mass production, in the ability to supply a force with what it needs to continue fighting. Bastogne's operational data leaves no doubt. While the United States was producing planes, trucks, ammunition and supplies on an industrial scale, Germany was struggling with bullock carts and an army with no ability to resupply itself. The true impact of this reality was devastating to the morale of the German troops. As one German intelligence officer reflected in a post-war interview, "We had nothing left to compete with. They had more of everything, more ammunition, more food, more fuel, and they were still producing more while we struggled to find fuel for our tanks." For the Germans, Bastogne was the last great lesson that modern warfare would not be won with military prowess alone. It would be decided by the ability to maintain an army in the field through continuous supplies. And in that capacity, the United States had the irrefutable advantage. American factories were producing more than 15,000 refueling trucks a month, which surpassed any German effort. They could drop tons of supplies from the air and send reinforcement units at any time without relying on traditional supply lines. The mere fact that the Americans could keep Bastogne supplied was the final proof that the siege, which the Germans believed to be a sure win, was lost from the start. The numbers don't lie. In terms of industrial production and logistical capacity, Germany was at an irreversible disadvantage. And, to make matters worse, time was against them. With the Americans now firmly establishing a supply line and overland corridor to Bastogne, the Germans found themselves with no viable alternatives. The sustaining power of the United States was proving decisive, not only for the victory at Bastogne, but for the final course of the war. What the Germans failed to understand throughout the Ardennes offensive was that modern warfare was being decided by the ability to stay in the field, not by the ability to withdraw or conquer territory. And Bastogne's operational figures proved that the United States had made logistical warfare its most powerful weapon. But this victory, while significant, was still far from marking the end of the conflict. What followed after the broken siege would be even more dramatic. Bastogne is no longer just a dot on the map and has become, for those who survived that winter, an uncomfortable mirror of the conflicting powers. On the one hand, the Germany of 1944 still stuck in the belief that discipline, tactical aggressiveness, and the mystique of the Blitzkrieg could compensate for an exhausted country. On the other, the United States, whose real strength was not in rifles or tanks, but in the ability to transform an entire nation into a continuous sustaining machine. And it was this structural difference, almost civilizational, that revealed itself before German eyes when Bastogne resisted. The Wehrmacht, which had shone in France in 1940 with speed and surprise, now found that modern warfare no longer revered brilliant improvisation. He revered maintenance, flow, the ability to supply. The German philosophy of war depended on quick victories, on decisive operations. But at Bastogne, he faced an enemy whose doctrine demanded no immediate victory, only resistance until the larger system was in operation. While the besiegers froze, cut rations, dismantled ammunition to repurpose explosives, and watched their wounded die without anesthesia, the defenders were provided with fresh blood, refrigerated plasma, surgeons, blankets, and newly arrived ammunition. The battle ceased to be symmetrical the moment the first parachute touched the ground. From that moment on, the Germans realized that they were fighting not against isolated soldiers, but against the expanse of an entire continent. The American soldier did not stand alone. He stood with Kansas, Illinois, New York, and California behind him. The machine that sustained it began in thousands of mills, workshops, docks, and railroads that transformed raw materials into palpable military power. And in the painful contrast, the besiegers saw the difference between heroic war and sustainable war. Heroism by itself does not ignite engines, does not produce gasoline, does not duplicate trucks, does not erect hangars. Heroism without support freezes to death in a trench. Germany, in that final phase, depended precisely on that. Faith, discipline, tradition. There were few tanks, little fuel, little food. The last reserves had been thrown into the Ardennes as a gesture of strategic desperation, believing that the enemy would break before them. But Bastogne was the supreme test of this belief. The city was not to endure a prolonged siege. The Germans knew that no modern force could survive in isolation for so long. But the mistake was in the premise. Bastogne was not isolated, she was connected to the sky. And this connection changed the meaning of war. For the first time in history, a surrounded force maintained full combat power through systematic air fueling. German doctrine, built on the experience of the First World War and refined in lightning campaigns, simply did not foresee this possibility. To surround meant to suffocate, but Bastogne breathed over enemy lines. For the German soldiers, each parachute that opened was a silent accusation. You fight with what is left, we struggle with what doesn't end. The moral defeat didn't come with Patton's arrival. It came the moment they realized that even the death of the last American wouldn't end the flow of supplies. Modern warfare had grown beyond tactics, beyond courage, beyond individual toughness. What would decide the future was not the brilliance of a commander, but the accumulated strength of millions of anonymous workers who, without firing a shot, carried the war on their backs. And this understanding turned the siege into a cruel revelation. Germany was alone. The United States has never been. The American victory at Bastogne is both logistical and spiritual. Logistics because it proves that war has come to be decided by the ability to keep a force alive under any circumstance. Spiritual because it reveals a silent pact between the nation and the soldier. The promise that no combatant would be left without ammunition, without food, without heat, without hope. For the Germans, this promise was impossible to keep. For Americans, it was routine. What Bastogne showed, inescapably, is that the war of the 20th century was no longer a contest of armies, but of civilizations, and one of them had managed to transform every factory, every road, every aircraft, every depot into an extension of the front line itself. Therefore, when the siege fell, the German defeat was not only military, it was conceptual, doctrinal, ideological. They found that they were fighting something they could no longer achieve, a power capable of sustaining the war indefinitely. And in the last Reich winter, this truth could not be more devastating, because the story is not over yet. Bastogne was just the announcement. The final chapter of the war was already written, and the next few issues would prove it. By the end of December 1944, when the last German columns were retreating under the heavy snow and the destroyed roads, what was left of the siege of Bastogne was no longer a military operation. It was a symbol of the definitive collapse of an entire doctrine. Germany had entered the Ardennes believing that it could repeat 1940, that speed and surprise would make up for the scarcity, that the enemy would give way before its own reserves ran out. But Bastogne proved otherwise. There, before the eyes of the besiegers, the ideological collapse became undeniable. They had surrounded the city, cut off roads, cut off troops, destroyed depots, had applied every classical element of their art of war, and even so, they failed. Not because of a lack of courage, not because of tactical inferiority, but because the war had changed, and they hadn't kept up. While Germany relied on bravery and non-existent fuel, the United States relied on production, coordination, and an industrial capability that simply ignored the concept of isolation. The siege did not fall when Patton arrived. It crashed as 241 planes filled the sky. From that moment on, the Germans understood that they could not defeat an enemy that sustained an entire city through the air. No tactical calculation survived this truth. And from Bastogne, every German soldier knew modern warfare belonged to those who could resupply, not just those who could advance. The universal lesson of this story is brutal in its clarity. Courage can hold a line, discipline can win a battle. The technique can create momentary advantages, but without logistics, no fuel, no ammunition, no food, no reinforcements, none of this survives. Bastogne became the definitive laboratory of this reality, a classic siege defeated not by a maneuver, but by a doctrine. The doctrine that war is won before the fronts, in the forges, in the factories, in the hangars, and in the ships that transport the force of an entire country to the battlefield. The 101st resisted not because it was unbeatable, but because it was not alone. And Germany lost not because it fought badly, but because it fought without what really matters in modern warfare: the ability to continue. That is why the final admission of the defeated carries such profound weight. Among the most forceful post-war confessions, a German general summed up the truth his soldiers had already grasped when they saw the sky over Bastogne. We were defeated by trucks, not tanks. This phrase, simple and bitter, is the epitaph of the Third Reich, not for the aesthetics of defeat, but for what it reveals. They did not lose for lack of courage. They lost because they were stuck in a past that the world had already left behind. If you value serious research and reconstruction of these facts that shaped the century, please leave a like and subscribe to strengthen this community dedicated to real history. And share in the comments what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating story about the invisible gears that decided entire wars. And so, Bastogne remains like the morning when the heavens said no to the Reich. On that December 23rd, the world saw that war had entered a new era, an era in which the strength of a soldier also came from the strength of an industry, of a nation, of a people capable of making the impossible fly. Final victory would still be months away, but his announcement echoed in the propellers of those C-47s that ignored German artillery and landed hope on the snow. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.